Hello and welcome to episode 6, part 1 of Conversations with History. I'm once again joined by my astute colleague, Mr. Benson Redmond from John S. Battle High School.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
And today we're going to discuss slavery in the Antebellum South. We're going to move on to discussing the sectional crisis between the North and the South after that. But this episode, part 1 of episode 6, we're really going to focus on slavery in the South because I think you can't understand America before the Civil War without understanding, to a certain extent, the nature of slavery.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you will see in most college textbooks about U.S. history, it becomes its own chapter, its own section, very much the way that you set this up here. And that is because we have to understand, this is an argument we're hearing in our modern era. We have to fully understand this history. And looking at, as you start here, looking at this, slave work in the South, understanding that piece of history and its detrimental effect sets up a greater crisis for us as a nation because of the plight of enslaved blacks in the South.
Right. So as Thomas Jefferson says, we have the wolf by the ears, and we at that point we can't let go. If we let go, it'll eat us alive. And the idea that even in 1800, Thomas Jefferson understood the impact that slavery was going to have later on the American people. So by 1860, there are about 4 million enslaved Africans in the American South. 4 million. And it's important to remember that the American South is the only place where the slave population will naturally increase through birth rather than importation.
1808 was the slave trade ban
by Thomas Jefferson.
By Jefferson. It's the convoluted nature of Jefferson is a whole episode that we could do, but we won't. So we're no longer importing slaves, but what's happening now that is important is that slaves, as they reproduce.
Right. And nowhere else in the Western world is that happening.
No.
In Brazil, in the Caribbean, especially Cuba, they have huge slave populations, but they're actually being imported still up until the 1860s. Yeah. In Brazil, Brazil doesn't outlaw slavery until 1886. So there's a lot of importation of slaves, but not into the American South. These are slaves born, second, third, fourth generation slaves by the 1860s, born in the American South.
And the caveat there is most state laws in the South, your not necessarily, I guess your, I don't want to say identity, the word escapes me, your status is based on your mother's status.
Yes.
And that's the important caveat. So if your mother is a slave, you were born
as a slave.
And that's the important caveat there.
So slave work in the South, there's this idea that slaves only worked on large cotton plantations and every other job was done by white people. And it's simply untrue. There were so many places where there were 4 million slaves working in the South, living and working in the South by 1860. They did work on large cotton plantations. And cotton is king. We'll get to that in a second. It's what James Hammond famously said, cotton is king. No one dares make war on cotton. But there were still large rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia. There were medium-sized tobacco and wheat farms in the Chesapeake, in Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and Delaware. There are small farms in Appalachia, where we live.
We tend to overlook that in Appalachia. We tend to overlook because we say, well, there weren't that many slaves. Well, that's true, but I will say one of the more detrimental, if not the most detrimental aspect of slavery that happened in Appalachia. And it wasn't, and we'll talk about this, the beating of slaves, but it was the separating of families.
Right.
And that occurred most frequently in Appalachia as to anywhere else as the punishment for slaves. So it happened. It existed in Appalachia.
There's a great book by Wilma Dunaway. It's entitled Slavery in the American Mountain South. And she talks about how in the American Mountain South, the chance of running away was much greater, and that there was greater distance between farms, so that slaves would often run away to see loved ones at farms that were, miles and miles away, and that being caught away from the plantation without a pass being given to you by the quote unquote master would result in severe physical punishment.
I was going to save this to later, but I think it's important here. The distinction between a runaway and a fugitive.
Right.
A runaway slave was a slave who temporarily left. Most often women. Most often women were runaways to escape the pressure, but they were only runaways because they had children.
Right.
Fugitives were those who sought a permanent break from the plantation, from their master. These were more often men who traveled north. And I think that discrepancy is one that I was often confused by. And I think understanding the difference in a runaway slave versus a fugitive slave is significant in the context of this conversation.
And we will get to that when we talk about resistance and rebellion.
Yes.
So
but just in the event those terms continue to
they're going to come up
because they're going to come up as we talk. I want the clarification. A runaway is a temporary leave, whereas a fugitive is the attempt for a permanent break.
Right. So small farms in Appalachia, in port cities, as what they would call stevedores, unloading ships and loading ships. Artisans, they were blacksmiths, carpenters, tanners, barrel makers, shoemakers, all these other things. They were taught trades. It was not uncommon by 1860 for slave owners to apprentice their slaves to artisans so they could come back to the plantation and be carpenters, tanners, barrel makers, those things. It also wasn't uncommon by the 1850s and 60s to hire out slaves. So you would actually you would hire your slave to an artisan, and they would pay you a certain amount for the use of that slave, and the slave would also be an apprentice.
And that leads us to one of the most famous Supreme Court cases,
right?
Dred Scott.
Yeah, which we will definitely get to in the sectional crisis. And then finally, in factories and cities, there's not a lot of industrialization in the South. There's not a lot of urbanization, but if you look at cities, especially like Richmond
or Atlanta,
Richmond in the ironworks,
Tredegar
Ironworks in Richmond, in the tobacco manufactory apparatus of Richmond, there were a lot of slaves who were hirelings. They were hired by those companies from plantations to the city, and they did what was called living out. That was what they called it, was that you lived outside of the supervision of your master. That this idea that slaves were always that they were always under supervision, that they were always being watched, is just not true. Even on plantations, which really had this more kind of all-encapsulating lifestyle where you were always near or around white people, especially in cities, this was not true. That you were basically living your own life. And that's why cities were often called the halfway point between slavery and freedom, that if you could be hired out to a city and you could live out without your master supervising you, that you were halfway there. You were halfway to becoming a free person. Living conditions for slaves, they generally, on larger plantations, they lived in crude log cabins, usually fairly close to what they called the big house.
Many times not even having a floor. Typically,
right, just a dirt
floor is what they entered the world. And you talk about food here. It was typically what was available to them. Oftentimes growing a little bit to help their diet, but it was comparable to the big house. It was meager rations, but very rudimentary.
Right. They generally studies have shown that slaves generally ate on a daily basis, they ate what white people ate. And in fact, some studies have shown that they had a more robust diet because they brought with them from Africa the growing of sweet potatoes. And Americans did not they saw sweet potatoes as slave food. Well, they weren't scientists because sweet potatoes are much better for you than white potatoes.
That's true.
They're much more nutrition rich than white potatoes. And so slaves often, they were allowed to grow their own gardens. They were allowed to spin their own fibers and make their own garments if they could. They were allowed to sell excess food, excess clothing that they created. It wasn't the case that slaves were never allowed to take part in the economy. Slaves generally, especially if they were in close proximity to a town, slaves were allowed to take part in the economy, to sell things, to make money. Slaves, there are many instances of slaves buying their own freedom through their own labors outside of working for their master, gaining enough money to buy their own freedom. Now, that was uncommon, but it did happen.
It happened.
So clothing and food were technically rationed, but slaves were able to kind of participate in the economy to the extent that they could supplement their food, supplement their clothing, and buy, things that they might want or need, or maybe even save enough money to buy their own freedom. It was not uncommon for slaves to steal food. They often, they would steal. The easiest thing for them to steal usually was poultry. That they would steal a chicken, this or that, to supplement their diet. Now, if you were caught stealing, there would be harsh repercussions, but it was something that a lot of times they were willing to risk in order to get more food. Disease was quite common, and African slaves, people of African descent, are generally more susceptible to diseases of the lungs than Caucasians are, just scientifically, just like African slaves were not. West Africans most of them have an immunity to malaria due to sickle cell mutations, but they are more susceptible to things like pneumonia, colder climates. This was a problem, and most plantations had infirmaries, like little doctors' quarters, like a little hospital almost. And slaves generally ran their own infirmary, and if a doctor was needed, the doctor would be called from the town, a white doctor. And it wasn't uncommon at all for slave owners to call the doctor, a white doctor, to tend to a sick slave.
And that's an important note here, because obviously we can't understate how bad slavery was. But this notion that it was this white master lording over and abusing to the extent that we have often seen, to put it, grotesquely, slaves were an investment.
It was an economic decision by Southern planters.
Slaves were seen as an economic investment, and therefore you had to take care of that investment. You did not want your slaves to be sick. You didn't want them to die, because then you're losing money.
Robert Fogel and Stanley Ingerman, in their book Time on the Cross, published in the 1970s, they did economic analysis of slavery in the antebellum, and they kind of came to the conclusion that you didn't see a profit from a slave until they were about 26 years old, right? So that their whole youth and adolescence was a loss monetarily for the slave owner. Now, they weren't doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They were doing it in hopes of that future profit. Right. It is grotesque and it's terrible. But to get into the mindset of a Southern planter, not only did they feel like they were racially superior, they definitely did. They felt like that African Americans were lesser than them biologically as a race, but they also saw them as an economic investment. And it's evil and grotesque, but to understand what they were thinking, you have to, begin to think that way when we talk about this.
I always tell my students as I'm teaching, it's really, really difficult for us in the 21st century to borrow the term, right, in a woke mindset, if you'll allow me that. It's hard for us to really grasp and understand, and that is the downfall of trying to teach history in a certain sense. But we have to allow ourselves to go back. We have to have that mindset to fully understand, to comprehend a lot of the decisions that were made.
Right. So slave treatment, and one book that I go back to over and over again is by George Raywick. It's called From Sundown to Sunup, and it's about slaves lives in the South, and it draws heavily on the WPA slave narratives that were recorded during the Great Depression by the Works program under FDR. And they talk, pretty commonly about being beaten, being whipped. Physical punishment was very common, that it would be doled out by their master, by an overseer, by a driver, a slave driver. It wasn't uncommon for slave drivers to be slaves.
I would add a caveat, though. I primarily read, as I did my master's work, I primarily focused on Missouri's history because that was the course that I was in. And that actually was not as frequent in many of those accounts, which is kind of interesting.
Right.
That in Missouri, it was not as commonly mentioned. I'm not saying it didn't happen, because there were some who did mention certain masters who were more aggressive, or overseers who were, but it was not as common as I thought it would be.
And if you read slave narratives, like you're going to read a little bit of Frederick Douglass's autobiography in this module, they will say, well, I had one master who was very violent, and then another who wasn't at all. And that's what you see in the WPA narratives, is that lots of slaves former slaves who were interviewed will say, well, I had one master who was, a Presbyterian minister, and he didn't allow anybody to be beaten on his plantation. But then we knew people from across the way, and they were getting beaten all the time. Violence was very widespread. Corporal punishment was very widespread during the antebellum. It was a way for slave owners to ensure that slaves stayed in line.
The fear was rebellion.
Right.
The fear was uprising. That said, there were those, as you've already mentioned, those racially superior views that existed. One former slave said that if he had the opportunity to go back, ever again to bondage, he said, I would rather die, because you're nothing but a dog, as recorded. And it may have been from one of the WPA things. And that was an old recording. But the understanding too then is, go back to what we just said. You also didn't want to abuse your slaves,
right, because
it's an investment. And you didn't want to abuse them to the point they couldn't work. You didn't want to beat them to the point that they would die
or run away.
Right.
So a lot of there are plenty of accounts in the WPA of slaves who would say, well, one slave driver, one overseer beat slaves mercilessly, and when the slave owner, they would refer to them as master. They said the master found out, and that guy got fired.
Yeah.
Because the slave owners, while they did believe in a racial hierarchy, they thought that African American slaves were lesser than them as people. They also were in the business of making money. They understood, if you beat slaves to where they cannot work, to where they run away, they're not going to get the harvest in, and you're going to lose money. And the bottom line was the bottom line.
Yeah.
These were very wealthy men. They did not become wealthy by throwing away money. They were very wealthy men because they exploited the system of African slavery so well, and they produced so much profit that they were able to build, the big house. They were able to build these huge palatial mansions in really.
And that comfortable lifestyle was something that they had become accustomed to. They didn't want that to go away.
Right.
Oftentimes in the Deep South, that also meant government power. So in order to maintain that, yes, you're going to ensure that stuck around. To some of these later points here that you've got, though, I think it's also important that we understand the sexual abuse that occurred within the system itself, as owners would often, really, they would rape slaves. It would further then, breed other slaves. This was common in many places. A deplorable practice.
Famously, Thomas Jefferson. with Sally Hemings, and who, just the thought of the fact that Thomas Jefferson, impregnated one of his slaves and then kept his own child as a slave.
Yes.
Right? That was not uncommon. It's something that to us we can't wrap our mind around. It's so grotesque and evil to us. You would keep your own child as a slave, but it was completely normal to them.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't excuse it.
And then it created a lot of studies will show within looking at slavery that there were several instances though where those children actually had a harder life because they were not accepted because they were mulatto.
Yeah.
And because of that, they were not accepted. They were not seen within the slave community as truly African.
Right.
And therefore, that only created a greater stigma even for them.
And the idea of miscegenation, or the intermarrying of different races in Spanish colonies and Portuguese colonies like Brazil and in South America, was widely accepted. It was not taboo in South America and the Caribbean for a white Spanish man or a white Spanish woman to marry someone of a different race. That was very common. It's what Gilberto Freire would call lusotropicalism, the idea that because the Spanish had lived with Africans throughout the centuries, they found them to be much more socially acceptable as far as intermarrying and things like that. In America, there will be miscegenation laws against the intermarrying of races until 1967. And even later than that in some states, but the Supreme Court
with the Loving v. Virginia
the Supreme Court doesn't officially rule that it's unconstitutional to have a law that says a white person can't marry a black person until 1967. It shows you that how deeply this racial divide was ingrained into people, especially in the South. So slave religion family, slave religion was a synthesis of African traditions that they brought from Africa. Right? We talked about this earlier in an earlier module. When African slaves showed up in America, they weren't blank slates. They brought traditions with them from Africa. And then they kind of synthesized that with Christian beliefs. And so slave worship services were often synthesized between African traditions and Christian traditions. And they were characterized by elation, being ecstatic, what they call getting happy. Right? The WPA narratives cannot be replaced. I mean, they are from the mouths of people who lived through.
They really are some of the greatest primary sources
right. and
that are available. And, a word of a disclaimer, the language used in them was very common to these former slaves.
Right. They commonly use the N-word.
Yes.
That's how they referred to themselves. That's how they referred to other African Americans, and it was just because that was how they had been raised. That word was something that they had heard their whole lives, something that we would not say now. But in the 1930s, it was still very common. But one thing that they do talk about, they'll say, "Well, we decided to have a worship service, and we were gonna worship, and we were going to get happy." Right? This idea of this ecstatic, elation, praying to God. But we didn't want the master to hear us because we were supposed to be in bed. So what we did was we turned the wash pot upside down, and then we got happy. This idea of turning the wash pot upside down comes back up over and over and over again in the slave narratives. And it was this maybe a synthesis of African tradition where certain vessels would have spiritual meaning. The idea was if you turn the wash pot upside down, it would not let the sound reverberate.
It wouldn't be heard.
Right. And it was like the masters knew that the slaves were having their own worship services, and that was technically not allowed. Right. And
the fear was
right.
The congregation of these enslaved persons
would
potentially lead to greater catastrophes for white owners.
Right.
Because that commingling of these enslaved persons could then lead beyond just the worship of God to the conversation of freedom.
Yeah.
Which was the greatest detriment to these slave owners.
And we'll get to how scared Southern whites were of that in a moment. But this idea of turning the wash pot upside down is just something to me that's like, it comes up over and over and over again. And masters would come out to the slave porters and say, "Hey, if you're going to have a worship service, you better turn the wash pot upside down. And that meant you can have a worship service, but don't be too loud, right? And to them, that was just totally normal, right? The idea of a slave marriages were not legally binding. They didn't get paperwork from the state that said they were married, which meant that their children were not technically their children. Their children were still the property of the master.
Oftentimes they would say in a slave wedding ceremony, till death or distance
right.
do you part.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a sad reality of when we look at slavery, at marriages, they had no legal footing. So
right.
therefore, families could be
separated. Mm-hmm.
Husband and wife could be torn apart.
Right.
Children could be removed.
And it was very common that if a slave committed a crime or a slave was a problem, an agitator for freedom, they would be sold.
And that was easier than the whippings,
right?
That are so often associated with that. Slaves, as they were sold, they were paraded. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes, they'll discuss feeling like livestock, mm-hmm. being paraded. This was something that was easier to do because the torturous marks on the back from mm-hmm. whippings showed that this was someone who was
a problem.
Selling them was so much easier and right. easier for.
And so when we talk about the intrastate slave trade between the Old South and the New South, about 1 million slaves will be transferred from the Old South to the New South between 1800 and 1860. About 1 million. About 75% of those were actually brought by their masters when they moved to the New South to start cotton plantations. The other 25% were sold and probably parted from their families. Now, once they're there, there's very little sale of slaves that goes on once they're actually settled in the New South. It was fairly uncommon that a slave would grow up on a plantation and experience a lot of turnover as far as people being bought and sold from that plantation, because a lot of these slave owners really did have this weird, grotesque, paternal attitude towards their slaves, that they were like a father figure to them. Right now, once again, totally evil father figure, but that
right. they were smarter.
Right.
They knew better.
That they had to take care of them.
And it was the commonly held belief that Africans were lesser
mm-hmm.
of a mindset. They had a lesser mindset. They were not as smart. They were not as educated. Therefore, they need me. Mm-hmm. They cannot sustain their own. They cannot sustain themselves. I am going to look over them.
Right. And so slave marriages were usually kind of demonstrated by what they call jumping the broom. This is something that is still very common in the Caribbean. People go to the Caribbean all the time and get married, and they will commonly ask them to jump a broom. Well, they're not really sure where this tradition comes from, but if you look at the WPA narratives of slaves, they'll say, well, I jumped the broom with this slave woman, and then she was sold, so I went to this other plantation, and I jumped the broom with this lady. The jumping of the broom was a common way that they had a marriage ceremony. Now, the nuclear family was not uncommon, that you would have a mother and a father and children on the same plantation, but the idea of a mother and a father and their children living in the same house and having the relationships that we now associate with the nuclear family was uncommon.
Yes.
Because children were kind of held in common. They were taken care of by elderly slave women who no longer worked in the fields, because women and men both worked in the fields all day, which meant that there were no mothers there to take care of the children. They were out working in the field. Children commonly ran around slave plantations naked until they were 7 or 8 years old. Yeah. Right? They were basically, they were treated as the young of livestock. That's literally how they were treated. They were kept alive. They were taught how to work, and they were slowly transitioned into working in the field. But when they were younger, they spent as little money on the children as they possibly could, because you were getting no return from that. Right? So the nuclear family, not uncommon, but definitely not what we think of it as today. Free black communities. As we said before, cities were centers of free black communities. There were very few free blacks that lived in rural areas. Slavery in cities was like a halfway point between slavery and freedom. And what we're seeing more and more as we do more studies of census data, lots of free blacks lived on plantations with slaves and white people, and they all lived together.
And this became later a problem as we get to that the antebellum period. Is we're kind of there because really antebellum is just that pre-war, but really that what we associate the 1840s, 1850s, knocking on the door of war. This became a significant problem though in those deep South states. And I wanted to point out Emily West did a fantastic job. Her book, Family or Freedom. And that's just it. Free blacks had a choice, family or freedom. And many states started writing laws to allow these former slaves to come back as a slave again. And you think, well, why on earth would you accept? But the choice was family or freedom.
Because most southern states passed laws that said if you manumit or set a slave free, within the next year, they must vacate the state.
And Arkansas was the state who in 1860, really early 61, I'm not exactly sure, they were about to do a massive drive to literally rid the state of all, like they were going to almost go house to house and force any free blacks out of the state. And the only thing that kept that from happening was the shots on Fort Sumter. And that literally prevented that from happening. But many states start to see, because of the problems, they're reading the handwriting on the wall. They had to do something, and so the forced eviction was soon to come.
And even in doing some of my own research for things that I've written in my time studying local history, I did a lot of work with wills, like last will and testaments, and large slave owners would set slaves free, and they would give them a choice. And they would literally in their will say, if this slave wants to leave, they can leave. But they understood, like you said, that leaving meant not just freedom, but leaving your family, right?
And oftentimes it was men were set free at the age of 18, which is an interesting caveat, but women 21. And I ask my students, well, why? And they never quite, some of them catch on, but it's because then at 21, they're a little bit longer and they have the opportunity then to reproduce, bear more children, and really bear more slaves is really what it was.
And so a lot of the states in the old Northwest, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, they have laws that bar freed blacks from coming into their state. So think about it. If you're freed from, say, Kentucky, and you have to leave, where are you going to go? You have to go to the Northeast. That's the only place you can go, or Canada, because you definitely can't go to another southern state. You cannot go to the old Northwest where land is actually plentiful. The only place you can go is the Northeast, because those are the only states that will actually allow you in. So the free black community never really gets over about 1% of the total population, and it is a very fragile community, very fragile, as far as at any moment, southern states could have just said, well, if you're a free black and you're living in Alabama, you're a slave again. And they could have enslaved all of them again. And so it was a very scary community to be part of. Slave resistance and rebellion. Open rebellion, not as common in the American South as it was in other New World colonies. Like there are plenty of slave rebellions in South America, plenty of slave rebellions in the...
Most famously would be Haiti.
Right.
In
the Caribbean.
With Haiti becoming its own independent country. But yes, open rebellion, to your point, not as common here.
1803,
Yes,
the
1803.
Haitian Rebellion scares people in the South to death, because it's black slaves rising up and killing all of their white masters and taking control of the government. And that is the worst nightmare of these Southern planters. There were some notable slave rebellion. The Stono Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina was fairly large. About 50 whites were killed during that. It scares people. Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831 will really be the catalyst for no longer allowing slaves to learn to read and write, no longer allowing slaves to have their own church services, no longer allowing slaves to live out, as in live in cities, live in larger towns by themselves, that supervision and fugitive slave kind of posses are always, like now we have like neighborhood watch. You'll see the signs that say like neighborhood watch. Back then they had like fugitive slave watch, that all white people, it was assumed in the South, all white people had this extra responsibility or duty to keep an eye on slaves and make sure they weren't plotting, make sure they weren't conspiring to start a rebellion.
And again, there's that word you use, that fugitive slave, those who are permanently trying to run away. It is a flight to freedom.
Mm-hmm. And there are other conspiracies that are uncovered. Gabriel Prosser conspiracy in 1800, the Denmark-Vesey plot in 1822. These are where they find slaves who can read and write, and usually they were religious leaders, like Nat Turner was a religious leader, Denmark-Vesey was a religious leader, and they find that they've written plans for revolt. And so this scares white people in the South, and it makes slavery harsher. It makes supervision more necessary, and it really creates by 1860 a society that is kind of paranoid.
The paranoia is deep.
Right.
I think the irony, though, is to your next point. So while the paranoia is really deep, slave resistance, while as drastic as a rebellion would be, mm-hmm. slave resistance in a lot of ways, I think, eluded many slave masters.
Right.
Because it's not just, as you say, rebellion. Right. It's not just running away. It's stuff like breaking equipment so they could do it. Or men would often slow the amount of mm-hmm. cotton they would bring in when they would see women were behind mm-hmm. and couldn't process it. Mm-hmm. And so they would intentionally start to slow down their picking of mm-hmm. cotton, as it was a slight form of resistance. And another book I would point out is Stephanie Camp. She did Closer to Freedom, Enslaved Women and Everyday Resistance in the Plantation South. Mm-hmm. Resistance could also it was hidden. Mm-hmm. They would sometimes dress up more, and they would go to parties. Mm-hmm. Singing and dancing became a form of slave resistance. Often for women, alcohol mm-hmm. was a form of resistance for men. And those two would often be combined in these back out in the woods, mm-hmm. out of eyesight parties mm-hmm. that existed for slaves. And that is a form of resistance that at least gave them a sense of liberation they wouldn't find while they're working.
Right.
And so that, again, it's a form of resistance.
It's so, you read some of the narratives. I keep going back to the narratives. There's no greater primary source than the slave narratives. And they'll say, well, the overseer beat this slave, so he ran away and hid in the woods. And then he convinced 5 or 6 others to run away and hide in the woods. And lots of times the masters, who were, once again, worried about the bottom line, they wanted to make money, they would come to the overseer and they would say, "What are you doing? Go and apologize. Get these people back to work." That a lot of times the distance was the overseers were not of the planter class.
No.
They were poor whites, and the bands of poor whites who tracked fugitive slaves, they had a real racial animosity towards blacks, because the only thing between them being the lowest people on the social ladder was slavery. Right. And so there are lots of stories of, an overseer beat a female slave. So when he was riding his horse through the field one day, the chain gang of male slaves just pulled him off his horse and killed him. And the masters would be like, well, maybe he deserved it. There was this idea that slave resistance, not rebellion, but slave resistance was kind of taken for granted. They were like, yeah, they're slaves. They don't want to be slaves.
The understanding was there.
Yeah.
If you can say it this way, the empathy is almost there. Mm-hmm. But as you said, the bottom line drives the day.
Right. They were making too much money. Mm-hmm. Slavery was too profitable. 5 million bales of cotton. 5 million bales of cotton is transported from the ports of the South to Europe in 1860 before the war breaks out. That is, and as we'll see when we talk about the sectional crisis, it's king cotton. No one dares make war on cotton. That was what they believed. It was so profitable. 52% of all exports of the United States were bales of cotton in 1860. It is the entire economy of the United States.
And I started to say, I'm glad you said that, of the United States.
Not just the South.
Because it's going north as well.
Right.
And northern manufacturers are getting rich on the back of slaves. And they don't want to admit it, and they don't want to talk about it. And there will be some abolitionists who point out the hypocrisy of the North, that we are for freedom, and yet we still make money off the back of slaves. And so the economy there, it drove that.
And that's the end of this part of the episode. We will come back with the second part, which will be about the sectional crisis very soon. I had a lot of fun, and I hope you learned a lot during this episode. We'll see you momentarily.